what it meant to be at Atari. And there's a lot of debate about that. But what occurred to me was that people came to Atari for a lot of different reasons. There were people who came there to do games, of course. You know, people heard about Atari, they thought it was cool. There were people who had home computers, which was a very unusual thing in the mid-1970s, and wanted to find a place where they could do the kind of stuff they were doing on their home computers, and Atari was a place for that. There were people who had moved forward in computer science in general, and not unlike myself, were completely bored working out in the industry, and wanted a place that was more dynamic and more interesting. And Atari was that. And Bob Smith was someone who came from, he was a boat builder and a craftsman, a carpenter. He did a whole bunch of different things, self-taught programmer, a lot of self-taught programmers there. People came from all over the place and from a lot of different backgrounds. For me, games were the third reason I went to Atari. I mean, the first reason I went to Atari because I was drowning at Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard is like called the software pasture. It's where programmers go to die. And all the passion that I had found programming an assembly language in college, which was awesome, was totally lost at HP. And I needed to find that. I needed to find that because I have to have passion in whatever I'm doing. And Atari was a place where people were acting out. That's how I heard about it, because one of my coworkers had a wife who worked at Atari, and I used to act out a lot at HP, which was very unusual at HP. It was very typical at Atari. And he would go home and tell Howard stories, and his wife said, oh, that's just like, you know, what happens every day at work. And he told me about that, and I said, well, where's that? Oh, it's Atari. So I went to Atari because it was an environment that I wanted to be in, because I could act out, have more freedom. And then I found out they do real-time control programming, which was what I loved to do. And so that was great. And the fact that they do games, well, that was nice too. But I went for the first two. So there was a lot of different paths that led to Atari. But as Ram Dass says, the paths to the top of the mountain are many, but from the top, the view is the same. So when we were all there, we were there and we were joined in this passionate pursuit. Passion was the essence of what was going on there. But even more, not just passion, right? These were people who came from a variety of creative endeavors. But what was going on at Atari was creativity. It was being creative. That was the big thing. They were all people who needed to do something, have to create something, have to make something. And when Atari basically fell over and died, and anything as imbalanced as Atari was cannot stand indefinitely. Okay, it was an awesome place to be, but it was always wobbling and you knew it was going to fall down at some point. And so, and a lot of us went on to do other kinds of creative things, and I went on to write and create videos, and ultimately I've become a psychotherapist. You know, you can pick up my cards, you know, at the autographing session later, if you're in need. But it was about being creative and the need to create. Because there are people who have jobs in creative production, and there are people who need to create. And those aren't always the same people. And creativity is something I think we desperately need in the world today, right? Because creativity is where new avenues, new possibilities come from. And I think creativity is something that's way underrated. And the thing that really joined us, that bonded us as a group at Atari, was creative need. Not just creative ability or creative desire, but there was a genuine need. We were all not quite competing with each other, but jockeying to show each other, look at what I did, look at what I made, with people who could appreciate the intensity and the magnitude of what we were doing. Because it's so funny, the 2600 is a platform that ties you into knots and runs you through the ringer to produce stuff that most people now go, eh. You know? And it's an absurd place to be. But it was also an amazing place to be, because if you're someone who likes to solve puzzles, if you're someone who likes to really work through something and come up with an interesting or innovative or creative solution that makes you feel like you really did something, you really did accomplish something, you thought up something, you found something new, that strikes you as like, I wonder if anybody else had found us, then that's the kind of person you needed to be at Atari. And we had an amazing collection of people like that at Atari. And that's what made it like one of the most intensely vibrant and fun places to be. So I just wanted to take a moment to really note that and to honor that. And how many of you consider yourself to be creative people? Yeah. So how many of you are actively creating things? Awesome. Awesome. Do more of that. Don't ever stop. It's also the stuff that keeps you young and keeps you rolling. You know, except in my case where you get older. But I think creativity is just, it's a really important thing, and it was something that was so valued at Atari. And one of the biggest things that ever happened at Atari was the transition in ownership, right, when Warner took over. Because under Nolan, creativity really was honored and valued. And one of the things that really created to the crash and everything that went on was the shift from a creative culture to a profit-oriented culture. And you know, there's room for both. I think in a successful company, you have to stress both. Companies that make no money have trouble keep on being companies. But companies that don't create also have trouble going on. But there's that tension in that war because they're not the same people. The creative people and the profit people. The way I like to put it is that, you know, there's two kinds of people in business, right? There's people who make things, and there's people who make money from people who make things. And there's a tension, there's a fundamental tension between them. That's something I explore in the book, you know, at great length. And because I think it's an interesting thing. And the stuff that went on Atari, one thing I hear a lot from people is that I see that stuff in my company. I see that stuff today. Yeah, you did. And you know why? It's one of the reasons I became a therapist. You know why I became a therapist? Oh, I do. I became a therapist because in tech, it's a pain in the ass to keep up with tech. Tech is changing so much. You have to keep learning and keep getting stuff. I'm a big fan of learning, but just chasing new techniques, and you know, the root of the word technique is tech. So it was just a pain to have to keep relearning my job and my livelihood every few years. And the great thing about being a therapist is although individual people can change, people don't change. The issues that people have, the problems people have, they're the same problems people have had for thousands and thousands of years. The difference is the toys they play with while they're having the same problems. And so I became a therapist, one, because I was way more interested in people and relationships than a lot of my companions. And two, it's so much easier to deal with just, you know, the issues of people, which is something I like, and it's the same issues all the time. It's not the same people, but it's frequently the same issues. It's a wide range of issues that also. So session to session to session, it's always a unique challenge. I'm constantly faced with a new problem to solve because that's the way I look at therapy. People come to me with a problem and I'm going to help them solve it. The illusion is that people come to a therapist who's going to fix them. And that's not true. I don't fix you. What I do, the great metaphor for it is like, you know, you're going to take a journey and I'm going to get in the car with you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy you gas, but I'm not going to drive. Right? You're still going to have to drive. And that's the thing about therapy. People want you to take the wheel. What do I do? What do I do? Well, let's talk about that. So that's a short one on therapy. I had some interesting stuff on therapy. Someone asked me the other day, why does therapy work? One of my clients come up with the most amazing stuff, you know, and it's awesome. So, you know, how does therapy work? So I had a variety of answers for that. And now on with the show. So we can return to that, or we can go to a general Q&A, but I would like to show you a clip from the DVD, at least one, because how many of you have ever heard of the sprinkler lobotomy story? Yep, and Todd Fry. How many of you have heard of the name Todd Fry? Yeah. And how many of you associate that name with Pac-Man? Yeah, because Todd did the 2600 version of Pac-Man. But Todd Todd was the guy who made Atari a cool place to be because Todd was a maniac and he would do anything. And so let's see if this works. Because if it does, this is going to be fun. So I give you the sprinkler lobotomy. Except I can't give it to you because we're not hearing it. What's I'm having a volume problem.
You have it muted on video.
Oh, it's muted? Are you kidding? Where's my unmute? Here it is. Thank you. Okay. Let's go this way.
Amusing guy. Todd used to talk about victims of biology.
Guess what?
And he was going to form.
We can
Yes.
restart.
We have the technology. We'll just plug our left ears. It's good.
Oh, that's going to be even better. Thank you. Thank you. All right. What did I tell you? Nothing happens without PGRE staff. I mean, that's what it's all about. Much appreciated. Here we go.
Todd was a high school dropout, but he's one of the most clever programmers I've ever known. Horribly maligned, I think, in the final analysis.
Yeah.
And an incredibly amusing guy. Remember, Todd used to talk about victims of biology, and he was going to form, yes, which he considered us all to be. And he was going to form a company called VobSoft, for victims of biology. And he had a little song which he sang, which I can still remember to this day. It was brain damage, baby, but that's okay. I had my EST today. Like the shock therapy, that's what I mean. Todd was a musician as well as a programmer, and much maligned.
And I got an environment to indulge acting out. You know, it's like, I never really thought of myself as a particularly odd fellow. I've heard rumors to the effect that I've had memorable impact on numerous people. Now I live in this skin. There's nothing particularly odd about either the skin or the thing that lives in it. I know one event. Obviously there's the apocryphal climbing the walls sprinkler lobotomy story. Boom, boom, boom. Whenever you heard that sound at Atari, you knew that Todd was walking the walls.
Todd Fry walking on the wall. I don't know if anybody else remember this.
I walked into the environment where I was going to be working, into the building, and I saw one of the senior programmers, Todd Fry, had a bandage on his head. And so I asked Todd, hey, well, how did you get that? I mean, what happened?
This guy, Todd, had this strange habit of, I don't know what you'd call it, but sort of shimmying down the hallway.
Todd was a very tall person. He used to be in construction. His favorite thing to do was to put one foot on one wall and the other foot on the other wall.
And I was like, off of the floor on the walls. I was like, that was just a first step. I mean, obviously, we're engineers, right? So what we do is like develop the system and explore its like capabilities and like develop new features. So then I discovered that what I could do is like with this hopping motion, is I could jump further up the walls.
He liked to climb the walls and be like a spider and get as high as he could.
Then I discovered that not only could I go upwards, but I could go horizontally too. And like I could cruise down the hall, you know, like 4 feet off the floor.
The width of the walls was not so great that he couldn't just get high velocity going along the wall.
Flying down this hallway, like all the way up to my head, all the way up to the ceiling. I came to an open door, and there's a normal technique for dealing with open doors. You just jump.
When he went to dismount, he kind of jumped up and caught his head right here on the sprinkler system.
Right here, I still have the scar. Like, ripped my forehead open. Cut me pretty bad. I was bleeding pretty bad. It's that kind of forehead blood. There was blood.
and he had to be rushed off to the hospital.
When we tried to explain that to the nurses, they said, well, how'd you do this? And so I told them the story, and they just laughed and said, yeah, no, what really happened?
Atari saying that Todd had an accident and was in the hospital, and that I should come and pick him up and we should leave early. And I was a little concerned what happened, and when I found out, it was kind of a joke.
But that was what really happened.
So they actually put that down on the accident report. Programmer injured while climbing the wall.
That's awesome.
From the Once Upon Atari DVD, which is the only piece of media ever produced entirely and exclusively by people who worked in the VCS at Atari, with the exception of Nolan Bushnell, who worked all over Atari. So, yeah, it was an interesting place to work. Fun stuff was going on, and he's right, it was an environment for acting out. Now we have social media. Which my definition of social media is it's a scoring system for acting out. So now you don't just act out, you actually get a score, and that's cool. So now you can measure it and see where that goes. But I think now, if anybody have any questions? Okay, well, here and here.
Okay. I guess I'm just curious, from a background as a very prevalent video game adaptation developer during the 80s, what do you think of some of the newer, like the new Indiana Jones or the films like that that came out, and how do you think it's impacted the legacy of of the games you created? Mainly just writers, not ET, but.
Right, because nobody's redone ET yet.
Yeah.
So, and that's a good point. From the perspective of an original developer back then to look at modern iterations and versions that people do today, I think, wow, that's a lot of memory. Games now are literally, I did, Gator Raiders was 8K, which was revolutionary at the time. 8K of code and graphics, okay? So now games are literally 1,000,000 times bigger, more in a lot of cases. So, wow, you've got a lot more resources. People are doing better stuff. I don't feel diminished by it. I think it's just like having a book and then someone makes a movie out of it, right? Which is another thing we should talk about. But, it's a different medium. And the way I look at it is working on the 2600 versus video game development today, it's a different medium. So you have different expectations, there's different approaches. I was criticized back in the day for doing stuff that didn't make sense, it didn't work, people couldn't get it, that are now commonplace things to do in games. I had bad timing, right? I was trying to push things ahead. So on some levels, it's relieving to know that some of the things I hinted at or nuanced then have become realities and now are actual integrated parts of games on a regular basis, and that's cool. That's exciting. So I think it's great to know that that property is still going. Because I can feel that my Raiders of the Lost Ark game actually supported the movie, whereas, on some levels, one of my other movie games might have killed the whole project. There was a question over here.
So it sounds like Atari was a fun place, but it was also a pretty intense place to work. Were there a lot of people who got there and found out they couldn't hack it or couldn't concentrate long enough to get a game made, or?
Yes, there were. Atari was an incredibly intense place. One of the reasons I am a psychotherapist today, and I mean that, is because I worked at Atari. Because Atari tended to produce two kinds of people, therapists and clients. So, but I'm being an aggressive goal achiever, became both. So that was cool. It was an intense place. It was a super intense place. There were more actual nervous breakdowns There were more people literally carted away from Atari from any other place I worked. It was not an it wasn't typical, but it was not uncommon to find out, oh, so-and-so, well, you won't be seeing them anymore. You know, it's like people, we would go catatonic in their office. We had some people who actually were removed to psychological institutions. I mean, it was for real, because there was a tremendous amount of pressure. The thing is, nowadays you have, you know, a small game is 4 or 5 or 6 people, you know, on an app or something. You know, console games now are hundreds of people, right? It's huge. And so it diffuses the responsibility. It diffuses the excitement and the credit a little bit too, I think, but it diffuses the responsibility. At Atari, when I first got to Atari, there were no graphics people, there were no sound people, there was the person who did the game, who had to be a programmer, but had to be a programmer and the sound person and the graphics person and all of that. Thank God they started hiring graphics people, because the games got much prettier then, because a lot of engineers, they're not graphics people, let's face it. So, but you were 100% responsible for the game, which means all the credit comes to you, and that's fabulous when it works. But when it doesn't work, well, the company was supposed to make millions of dollars based on this thing that was on your shoulders, and you blew it, you know, if you didn't deliver. I was one of the few people who was able to deliver and blow it. So, you know, that was good too, but you know, like I said, aggressive goal achiever. But it was a super intense place. Yes?
So, on that note, one of your games took years and years. If I recall correctly, Indiana Jones took 9 months. And somewhere in there from what I saw in interviews, and then that one game took 5 weeks. My question is, what took so long? Or what took not so long? How long did it take to program a game? Why did it take so long? And then how could a game like E.T. get done? And regardless of what anybody thinks about it, how quickly?
Okay, this is a fair question. So in terms of 2600 development, the question is, like, how long does it take to make a game? So you were very close. I mean, Yar's Revenge took me about 7 months to develop, and then it underwent 5 months of testing before release, which was the most tested game in Atari history. I don't know why, for some reason every game I do has to be the most whatever. But Raiders took 10 months, and that was a lot. And games, because the idea of making a game, it's a voyage of discovery. It is truly a voyage of discovery, right? You're gonna make a game on the VCS, so you have to start with an idea, just some raw idea of a gameplay that's gonna be okay. And you're gonna work on this until you turn it into something that doesn't suck. That's basically the working definition, right? You work on it until it doesn't suck. And who decides whether it sucks or not? It's the game makers. You know, that's the way Atari was originally conceived. You work on it, and this process should not take more than 6 to 8 months. That's the idea. And when someone is hired on at Atari, they give you a manual and a development system, and that's it. And then in about 3 or 4 months, if you don't really have something at least cooking on the screen, you're gone. It was definitely a sink or swim environment. So, but games take that long because what you're gonna do is you're gonna keep working on the game until you do something that's worth playing, okay? So then there's the question, okay, well, if games take 6 to 8 months, then how can you do a game in 5 weeks? Well, the answer is, you know, you're insane, right? And you have some sort of neurotic need to prove something and do something, so when someone says, hey, we got a game, we have to make it in 5 weeks, can you do it? You know, you say, oh, yes, of course I can do that. Absolutely, there was no question in my mind. I had no idea what I was gonna do, but I knew I would do it. And so, but the thing is, ordinarily, the goal is to make something that's fun, and it takes as long as it takes. The way you make a game in a shorter period of time is you say, I'm gonna make a game that can be finished in this period of time, and then I'm gonna see how fun I can make it, which is a different design goal. But it all comes down to design, right? If you always wanna know how do you approach something, look at the design. Design is the key to all creative endeavors. And if you're really, see the problem with E.T., the real problem with E.T., now think about this. The real problem with ET is that ET achieved 100% of its original design concept. That's the problem with the game. Now, that doesn't sound like a problem, right? You think, oh, congratulations. You wouldn't expect it. How did the game go? I achieved 100% of my design concept. Oh, sorry to hear that. You never have that conversation. But the truth is, if you look at successful products and then if you look at the original design, you will see that usually the final product is substantially different from the original design because it got better. Because along the way, remember, voyage of discovery. As you're working on it, you learn stuff, you find stuff out, you learn some things work, some things don't, and as you roll that new information into the design as you go, the game gets better. And a short development time does not have the chance to do that. It loses rumination power. And in the book, there's a very interesting discussion of Rene Descartes and how he dealt with the problem of rumination and stuff. And it's a historical recreation. Yes?
What kind of projects in media was inspiration for the games you made, especially like other Atari projects and stuff you would see?
For which, the ET game?
Or just any games you made?
Well, I can definitely tell you what the creative inspiration for ET was. I ditto Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yar's Revenge was based on a coin-op game called Star Castle. And that was assigned to me. And the fight, I don't know how many of you know this, but when I first interviewed at Atari, went through this whole series, everything was cool, here we go, and they rejected me. They rejected me. And I did not accept their rejection. I pushed back because I knew that was a place I had to be. So I pushed and pushed, and I negotiated with them, and I managed to negotiate a 20% cut in salary for myself and probation. And that's how I came to Atari. And so I was just desperately trying to get in there and prove I could do it, and then they gave me my first assignment, Star Castle. And as someone who was on the edge in probation, who's supposed to just do whatever we say, the first thing I did was I analyzed the game, I read the manual, looked at the hardware, I went to my manager and said, this game's gonna suck, we can't do this game, this is gonna be hard. And so, but I also had a presentation, I had graph paper where I had drawn out screens, for a presentation. I said, here's a different approach that uses some of the same topological elements of the game, but I think this is better adapted to the hardware and stuff. And I was fortunate, it was early enough that they said okay. And then I launched on a game that wasn't Yar's Revenge at that point. This was just this game that's not Star Castle, basically. And then I added I wrote the backstory for Yar's Revenge. Yar's Revenge was her first backstory, right? And because I wrote a backstory for it to sell the game. There was a lot of firsts in Yar's Revenge because my goal with Yar's Revenge wasn't just to make a game, it was to make an entree to the industry. And the way I figured to do that is to innovate. What is it? Buckminster Fuller has a great quote. I love this quote in terms of creativity and innovation. He says, you never change reality by fighting the current reality. He says, the way you change reality is you build a better model that people are forced to adopt. And if you look at the history of innovation, you will see that, a lot of times they're knocked initially because nobody wants to change what they're doing. But if you do the right thing, when they came up with cars, people stopped using horses because cars were easier and better to work with. They had their own problems, but it obsoleted horses. Nobody came up and said, stop using horses. We're just not going to use horses anymore. That would never work, right? So this is a concept of change. So I tried to do things in Yar's Revenge people hadn't seen in games before that would become regular features in games. And that was, the thing I'm most proud of with Yar's Revenge, right? Was the idea of the number of firsts that it had, the ways it changed what games are. So that was cool. And then Saboteur, my fourth game that, didn't get released for 20 years. I did the fastest video game development, but I also did the slowest. I did a game that was virtually finished, and then Atari died, and then was revived 20 years later, so Saboteur. And my inspiration for that was just to make up some stuff, and that was hard. That was hard because I didn't have something to work with. That one was just pulled out of my head, for lack of course, where you find my head frequently completes the usual version of that expression. It's I just wanted to make up new gameplays. I wanted to do things that no one had really thought of before. So I tried to come up with 3 or 4 unique gameplays. And that was the inspiration for that, a multi-screen, this is kind of cool. Thanks. Does that answer your question? Excellent.